My name is David Lurie. I teach Japanese history and literature here at Columbia, and I am, along with Professor Manakia from MISAS, one of the two co-organizers of the newly revived program in world philology. And I'm really grateful to see so many people here today on this cold day, including many of you who are not my students and were not forced to come here. I'm also grateful to my students for not rebelling against my insistence that they attend. And also, while I'm thanking people, I want to thank, first of all, the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for providing the venue and the logistical support and doing so much to help us with the revival of this program, and also the other co-sponsors of this particular event, the Colloquium on Literacies across Asia, also across East Asia, or CLIA, Critical Chinese Humanities Series, the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and ICLS, the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society. So before I introduced our wonderful speaker, I want to just say a few words about the program in world of philology. This is something that was created about 7 or 8 years ago by myself and Sheldon Pollock, and has kind of gone into a sort of a dormancy, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of other reasons, and that we're very happy to be reviving this year. And the idea of the program in world philology is to bring together faculty at Columbia and Barnard across departments and schools, as well as faculty from outside of the university who come as visitors, who are focused in various ways and from various perspectives on how texts exist in society, how human groups of various human groups over time have made sense of text, how they've cared for them, how they've worked with them, how they have manipulated them, edited them, commented on them, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea of this is to gather together people with common concerns across different departments and different disciplines to sort of bridge gaps created by those disciplines, also gaps between the West and the non-West, between the pre-modern and the modern, and to give you a sense of the variety of the kind of concerns that we think of as being relevant to the program in world philology. I'll just mention a few of the talks from the previous version before it went dormant. We had Karen Barber speak to us about oral and written texts in Africa. We had Anthony Grafton speak to us about Christianity and philology in early modern Europe. And we had Shamil Jeppy talk to us about philology in Timbuktu. And so that gives some sense of the range of geographical and temporal range that we think of as being incorporated into this concept of world philology. And I can think of no better person to inaugurate the sort of second round of the program in world philology than our guest tonight, Professor Tamara Chin of the Department of Comparative Literature at Brown University. Professor Chin works across an amazing variety of topics, concerns, and periods. Her research interests include pre-modern Chinese literary and material culture, feminist economics and the history of economic thought, global classical reception studies, and ancient contact and exchange. Professor Chin has a degree in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and she's published widely on these topics that I've just listed. Probably most prominently, her first book from 2014, which I see is now out in paperback, which is great news from a couple years ago. The book is entitled Savage Exchange, Han Imperialism, Chinese Literary Style, and the Economic Imagination. And this is a book that examines the politics of representation during the Han Dynasty expansion of the Chinese political empire and Silk Road trade. And this won multiple awards, including the American Comparative Literature Association, Harry Levin Prize, and the International Convention of Asian Scholars groundbreaking subject matter accolade. Professor Chin has published widely on a range of other topics, but her most recent publications include a piece on colonization, Sinicization, and the polyscriptic Northwest from the Oxford Handbook of Classical Chinese Literature, and a recent article from the PMLA entitled The Afro-Asian Silk Road, Chinese Experiments in Post-Colonial Premodernity. It is a great honor for me to introduce Professor Chin speaking to us today about contact philology. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to Professor David Lurie for that lovely introduction, and to the program in World Philology, and to Lindsay Schramm and everyone at the Heyman Center and all the generous co-sponsors for inviting me here. I'm honored to be here. And thank you to everyone for coming out on this freezing, busy Tuesday night in the middle of everything that's going on. I'll talk for 45 to 50 minutes, and there are lots of slides. Curiosity about the connected past had to overcome a dominant 19th century focus on individual nations. In Europe, academics partitioned the past into discrete nations and languages. In China, Confucian scholars focused exclusively on a Chinese canon. Between 1870 and 1970, during the century spanning new imperialism, decolonization, and the Cold War, historical contact became a respectable object of inquiry that nonetheless remained secondary to national studies. The muted clamor for connected history came from a tangle of places, politics, and disciplines. It came from the colonialist and the anti-colonial, the capitalist and the communist, the antiquarian and the activist. The book from which today's talk is taken aims to trace the rise and fall of a set of modern subfields and genres devoted to historical contact. I look at a set of regions and disciplines. I focus particularly on systematic efforts to make pre-modern Afro-Eurasian contact that included China into a serious research object. My basic argument is that the modern colonial encounter in and around China prompted unprecedented interest in the connected past. In the mid-19th century, Britain defeated the Qing Empire in the Opium Wars, forcibly opening China's ports to free trade in opium and other goods. And it's in this context that scholars in Europe, East Asia, and elsewhere, please sit, you can use these seats here. There's a lot of stuff on the screen. And it's in this context that scholars in Europe, East Asia, and elsewhere became interested in the deep history of China's international trade. In philology, as well as history and geography, China became a leading example in calls to reconstruct against the grain the antiquity of the globalizing world. Today's talk addresses two slightly different questions. First, what's the place of the study of contact in the history of philology? Where and when did the study of contact become systematized in different regional traditions of what we now call world philology? What did the study of contact do to the discipline of philology? And second, please come in. What is the place of the discipline of philology in the broader history of the study of contact? I have two basic arguments. First, contact philology arose from the multidisciplinary study of contact, not from within philology or within the specialist study of language and literature. Contact philology emerged as a set of minor subfields and research agendas. These are sort of in black there, the disciplines in red and the regions in blue. Contact philology emerged in a set of minor subfields and research agendas within the broader multidisciplinary study of what I refer to for convenience as contact, but that encompasses a set of overlapping semantic fields of what the 19th century geographers called in Europe intercourse or commerce or Handels- und Verkehrsgeschichte or trade and transport, or that 20th century Chinese historians called communications or 交通. Academic interest in contact was not new to the 19th century, but I'm interested in the emergence of contact or intercourse or 交通 as a named and coherent and rigorous object of research applicable to any place or period, even if at the level of a minor subfield. During the 1870 to 1970 rise of disciplinarity, that is, it's a period characterized by both the global rise of the research university and the rise of the modern humanities and social science disciplines. The 1870 to 1970 period is also characterized by the rise and fall of philology, as I'm sure many of you have been studying. Philology in 19th century Europe was both the queen of the sciences, as Sheldon Pollock puts it, as well as the foundation of the humanities in Siraj Ahmed and James Turner's respective accounts. In the 19th century, philology encompassed the study of both language and literature, grammar and textual criticism, and social critique. For philologists, the research value of historical contact came from other disciplines. Geography and history first made the history of trade and transport a systematic research topic, although not a high prestige topic before 1970. Contact philology, as I'm calling it, became important for its contribution to this broader historiography of contact, that is all of these together, rather than for its contribution to, say, cutting-edge linguistic theory or to the field of philology itself. So it's this broader context that matters. Second, I argue that contact philology was inspired both colonial, excuse me, and anti-colonial efforts to reform Oriental philology. Interest in contact did not reflect one particular ideology or epistemology. Contact philology was not and is not itself liberatory. But contact philology did, during this 1870 to 1970 period, sometimes serve as a self-conscious counter-practice to the racialization of philology. By relying on international and transnational frameworks of history, contact philology tended to foreground the significance of effective rather than genetic ties, commercial history over the history of racial migration and conquest. I'll say a little more about structural disinterest in contact before turning to these three hubs, India, China, and French Indochina, these hubs, as I'm calling, of contact philology. Thank you. The 18th century Oriental philologist William Jones famously proposed that Sanskrit was an ancestral language of Greek and Latin. You can just see there. The discovery of what came to be known as the Indo-European or Indo-Aryan ethno-linguistic family tree that you can see, it's down here, or Stammbaum, displaced an older biblical tree of nations. Comparative philology proposed that all the world's ancient and modern languages could be genetically classified in the same way as Indo-European, that is, by its grammar. When William Jones classified Sanskrit and Persian as part of the same Indo-European tree, as many of you know, he excluded the significance of, say, Arabic loanwords in Persian. In the pure Persian, I find no trace of any Arabian tongue except what proceeded from the known intercourse between Persians and Arabs. Any historical intercourse between Indo-European languages like Persian and a Semitic language like Arabic didn't count. In George Grierson, who undertook the Linguistic Survey of India, he says if there's one principle that's universally accepted in comparative philology, it is that languages must be classed according to their grammars. The aim was to find, please sit, there are seats at the front here. The aim was to find grammatical rules in the inflection of verbs and nouns and to find the root forms of words and their genetic relation to other word roots. Later on, with the rise of modern linguistics, as it came to replace the study of language, scientific study of language came to replace philology, Saussure said, external linguistic phenomena, historical contact, loanwords, and so forth, are not as important as the internal structure of the language itself. So that there were intrasystemic reasons for language change, and that's what mattered. Sorry, Lindsay. I see. Thank you. Against this predisposition to see language contact as secondary, What we have now, post-1970, post-1980 subfield in linguistics, there is a subfield called contact linguistics that's now seen as the sort of the subfield dedicated to what's called contact-induced language change. So contact linguistics is a subfield now. Since the 1980s, practitioners of contact linguistics have looked back to the 19th century, retroactively making people like Hugo Schuchart, the German linguist, the sort of ancestors of contact linguistics now. In the late 19th century, Schuchart argued that there's no such thing as a completely unmixed language. He said, if we connect the branches and twigs of the family tree with countless horizontal lines, it ceases to be a family tree. And what Schuchart was interested in were pidgins, creoles, what he called then commercial languages, Handelssprachen, slave languages, and languages of necessity, like Indo-European Portuguese and other languages. And other linguists at the time who were interested in contact as a non-mainstream practice were in general or often interested in non-Indo-European languages. So Schuchart, for instance, was interested in Basque. Franz Boas also protested the family tree Stammbaum model, worked on Native American languages. And what I'd like to bring today to this conversation of sort of thinking about the earlier history of contact linguistics, but also what I'm calling contact philology, are the debates that also came out around what was at the end of the 19th, early 20th century called Indo-Chinese. Nowadays, we call it Sino-Tibetan. And to think about this prior interest in language contact that militated against the Stammbaum theory, the family tree history. So I'm going to move on now to the hubs where interest in contact developed. In French Indochina, French colonial Asia, a group of philologists founded a bulletin that is still up and running. Some of you will be familiar with it, the Bulletin de l'École Française d'Extrême-Orient, that in its opening manifesto argued the following. The bulletin will be devoted to the philological study of East Asia, according to a more usual expression, which we will use when extending it to India, of the Far East, Extrême-Orient. The Far East is not only a geographical expression, it's a historical reality, unified to a certain extent by the spread of Buddhism, connected by the incessant to and fro of travelers, pilgrims, ambassadors, merchants, connected by war and politics. India and China constitute elements of a distinct system, which they must both help to explain. So we see more and more Oriental philology following an evident need, bringing together once distinct disciplines, the Indianists becoming sinologists to write the history of India, and sinologists engaging in the study of India to explain Chinese antiquities. Established by the course of events at the border of these two civilizations, France seems to be in the most favorable position to link together these specialist studies far too isolated. So two aspects of this new early 20th century Oriental philology are important. First, they approach language history from a geographical perspective rather than a linguistic or racial one. The starting point for a new philology is the peculiarity of this region they call the Far East, not the peculiarity of a particular race or language family. This Far East combines East Asia with India and with it Southeast Asia, Central Asia. This is Orientalist geography in the Edward Said sense. The colonial French in Asia are the expert observers of the Far East, but are somehow not part of the Far East. Second, the philologist Far East or Orient is characterized by contact, the incessant to and fro of ancient traffic, not genetic descent. This deep history of contact collapses the modern disciplinary divide between Indologists and Sinologists, between Indo-European studies and Sino-Tibetan, and Indo-European studies and Sino-Tibetan or Indo-Chinese studies. This form of Oriental philology didn't come from, wasn't sui generis. It looked back to a 19th century set of interests in language contact, and particularly loan words. Loan words are words adapted from another language, and contact linguists have since said that loan words serve as the prototype and also the most widespread and extensively documented form of what happens in contact-induced language change. The French were in competition with the British and the British Maritime Empire, the administrators and geographers outside of academia started producing these lexicons of pidgins, creoles, and of the language that greased the wheels of commerce of maritime empire. So the French professional Oriental philologists would invoke as their inspiration these set of non-academic geographers who were interested in the specialist study of what came to be known by the British Hacklet Society, which is still existent, as the history of intercourse, the history of travel. So you can see here that these non-academic genre of what's called histories of commerce, that are sort of sustained histories of ocean histories, sea histories, transcontinental histories, were produced by geographers, commercial geographers, as a genre, as a specialist subfield during the late 19th century by those who were actually out there building canals, building railways, and so forth, putting the history of modern connectivity into a deep history. And along with the history of commerce, they were interested in the history of the language of commerce. And that's what this background map is. Hobson and Jobson is perhaps the most famous, to be produced by Henry Yule, who himself produced these histories of intercourse that became influential both in French Indo-China, but also in India and in China. Loan words like satin, satrap, from Hindi, pajamas, shampoo, from Chinese typhoon, tofu. You get the sense of what these lexicons were about. I also add Friedrich Hirt, a German administrator who worked for nearly over 20 years in the Imperial Maritime Customs. He also produced these loanword studies of sorts and became the first professor of Chinese at Columbia thereafter. Moving back to French Indochina, I just want to give you one example of perhaps the most famous Orientalist to come out of this group. Paul Pelliot began his career in French Indochina. He was there with the founding of the Bulletin, and his first work was on these sort of histories of commerce, these histories of China-West maritime relations. He then goes to Dunhuang in northwest China, and that area of Xinjiang and northwest China, Gansu province, was a very busy place early 20th century with the discovery of cartloads, tens of thousands of manuscripts, as in this Buddhist cave library, as it's called, in Dunhuang. That's him in 1908. He looks at thousands of manuscripts and takes thousands of them to Paris. And these manuscripts were found in languages like Bactrian, Chinese, Hebrew, Kharosthi, Khitan, Khotanese, Parthian, Persian, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Syriac, Tangut, Tibetan, Tocharian, which I'll talk about later, and Uyghur, to give you a sense of the kinds of archives that were discovered at the beginning of the 20th century that really transformed and became a ground zero for the study of contact. And Paul Pelliot, after he moves back to Paris, starts writing about Central Asian and not just maritime overland connections, dedicating thousands of pages to studies of individual loanwords as well as whole sets of them. The one aspect of this set of scholarship that arose during this time is that it's interesting to contrast what I call the academic style of the Dunhuang philologist with that of the Indo-Europeanist. German pioneers of comparative grammar emphasized the utility and the seriousness of grammar. They constructed general rules and taxonomies in the way that brought dead and living languages together. By contrast, the European Dunhuang scholar often displayed an affinity for the irregular and the inconsequential. Pelliot did not seem to mind the characterization of his being unable or unwilling to distinguish between the important and the unimportant. When asked Why do you use your fantastic knowledge to clarify matters of no consequence? Pelio allegedly replies, it amuses me. It amuses me. And against the seriousness of the Indo-European philologists at the time, and during the disciplinary decline of philology in this early 20th century period, contact philology styled itself as a minor field, as a highly erudite, but theoretically non-serious, politically non-controversial practice. The rest of my talk will turn to contact philology in Asia, and I'll first look at India here. In India, the dedicated historical and philological study of Indian contact to its east took the name Sino-Indian Studies or India-China Studies. And a key institutional hub here was the Vishvabharati University in Shantiniketan, set up by the Indian writer Rabindranath Tagore near Kolkata. Tagore, as many of you know, visited China in the 1920s to establish India-China relations independent of British intermediaries. A rhetoric of reconnecting ancient India-China civilizational ties surrounded these visits. And the mission of the China Bhavana, the China Hall that was set up in 1937, was explicitly not only to revive our old cultural relationship, but also to create a new fraternity between our two nations. And one of the journals that was associated with the China Bhavana was Sino-Indian Studies that ran 1944 to 1957, and its manifesto, its self-description was as follows. The journal deals with Chinese materials on Indian history and civilization. Its main feature is a systematic study and translation of ancient Indian texts that are lost in the original, but preserved in ancient Chinese translations. It also deals with various aspects of ancient Sino-Indian and connected topics. A couple of things to note here. First, Sino-Indian Studies took the study of ancient language contact as a way of rediscovering and reviving diplomatic relations in their mission statement there and also here. Second, I want to say a little bit more about this project of recovering lost Indian texts that highlights a specific genre of ancient texts as the sort of ground zero of contact philology, namely East Asian and Central Asian Buddhist mantras and dharani. Mantras and dharani were central to medieval Silk Road Buddhism, and they were set sequences of chanted Sanskrit syllables or words. They were valued more for their sacred sound rather than their represented meaning. They had a spell-like efficacy. Sanskrit mantras were generally transliterated or phonetically transcribed with Chinese, Tibetan, Japanese, Korean, Khotanese scripts, or juxtaposed, as you can see in the background here, with Sanskrit in this particular Siddham script. And when the philologists who wrote for this journal, but also prior to that, other Orientalists had done this too, they came across texts that were all in Chinese, but when read aloud had no meaning at all because they were transcription of Sanskrit mantras. And so the Orientalists had to reconstruct from the ancient pronunciation of the Chinese text, and from that reconstruct what the original Sanskrit does. This is one example there. Now, one small point I just want to point to here is the difference between learning Sanskrit as a non-Sanskrit speaker in the medieval period in Asia and learning Sanskrit in Europe or the US in the modern period or even now. Back then, the focus was on the sound, the system of sounds, the phonology of Sanskrit, with the aim of Buddhist mantra recitation. Whereas if you learn Sanskrit now, you begin with grammar, you begin with the conjugation of verbs. And the concern of modern comparative philology was language classification. So it was a different approach to this world of Sanskrit outside India. One example that I want to give from this China Bhavana is Prabhu Chandra Bagchi, who was the director of China Bhavana and himself was educated in Paris. He was a student of Paul Pelliot, Sylvain Lévy, Antoine Melier, and so he is a sort of an intermediary between Chinese as well as European philology. He also visits French Indochina, Japan, and he becomes the inaugural chair professor of Indian studies at Peking University. I'll talk about his early work in a minute, but what's interesting is that he also worked on language contact between so-called Indo-Aryan and non-Aryan languages in Sanskrit and other Indian languages, that he's already interested in thinking about language contact with Sanskrit. And then he goes on and does this with Chinese. And he becomes the editor, he's the founding editor of Sino-Indian Studies. Just to give you a sense of the kind of work that he was involved with, this is from his doctoral publication on a Buddhist Chinese monks' bilingual lexicon of Chinese and Sanskrit. It's for the Chinese Buddhist monk who's trying to learn Sanskrit and wants to figure out how to pronounce it. So here, for example, you have the Chinese word for the word for paper, and that's in green. And then in red, you have the early Sanskrit word, which is for paper, ashaya, which is a sort of way of the Sanskrit speaker of saying paper, the Chinese word that is there. And then you have, for the Chinese person who wants to learn how to pronounce Sanskrit, you have the phonetic transcription using Chinese characters, a phonogram spelling of the Sanskrit. So what you have is a kind of an echo chamber of Chinese imitating Sanskrit speakers, imitating Chinese speakers, and so forth. And this is, you get the sense of the kinds of materials that these philologists were working with then. Again, the context is very different in India because it's part of the nationalist Indian and nationalist Chinese internationalism, in which they're trying to form modern diplomatic relations based on Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai fraternity, based on ancient ties. And this is my final example, will be in China. And I'll just say something briefly about the pre-20th century relationship to language contact. In traditional Confucian philology, the philology that was established through and maintained through the imperial examination system that was abolished in 1905, that credentialed all scholar officials. The mastery of the Confucian canon lay at the center of that. And the limit, although there were multilingual or bilingual lexicons of the many living languages that were spoken in China, Manchu, Uyghur, and so forth. In the Ming and Qing, they produced these lexicons of living languages. Attention to historical contact between languages was a very minor topic, and it does appear in places, for example, in the study of Altaic, Mongol, and Khitan Jurchen loan words from Northern Asia in Chinese that were transcribed during the so-called conquest dynasties, Liao Jinyuan dynasties, when people wrote in Chinese loan words from these other languages. And the study of that, the subsequent study of that was found in canonical histories, was only useful insofar as it helped the Confucian scholar better understand the reading of the ancient histories. It wasn't a practice of trying to understand language contact or seeing that as a proper field of studies in itself. We come to the 20th century, this structural disinterest in contact continues. The modernization of Chinese linguistics and philology, both of which came to China and often were called yuanxue, or there was also yuanxue that I'll come to in a minute. In this diagram that was displayed in the US in the early 1920s by the linguist Li Jinxi, this sort of typifies the focus on giving an account of the modern Chinese language. So this 4,000-year history of Chinese culminates in the standardization of the national language, Romanization, finding an alphabet, and instances of language contact that feature in a diagram like this matter insofar as they help clarify or they shed light on the primary project of linguistics at the time, which was to reconstruct the pronunciation of early Chinese, how Confucius himself pronounced it, except now written out in a phonetic alphabet. So pre-modern contact with Sanskrit, Manchu, Latin only matter as precursors to the standardization and Romanization of Chinese. So during the 20s and 30s, there was a very specialist subfield called twentieth-century, which is transcription studies that you would have thought would be devoted to language contact, but actually in looking at transcriptions of Chinese in, say, Sanskrit or in Latin, they're actually interested in using the phonetic transcription in order to figure out how in the 18th century or the 12th century Chinese was pronounced, because you can't tell by just looking at the character how it was pronounced now or then. And so that's what the focus of these specialized fields like transcription studies were about. Now, this changes, and what I'm calling contact philology appears in later in the 20th century. And I'm going to look at two examples. Ji Xianlin, who and Ma Jian, both of whom taught at Peking University, and both became active in setting up an Afro-Asian Asia-Africa studies there that I'll talk about in a minute. Just to say briefly, Ji Xianlin, like many other philologists at the time, was educated, had graduate education in Europe. He had a PhD in Indo-European languages from Göttingen, and he spent a lot of his life researching Sanskrit Chinese and Tocharian Chinese contact. I'll talk about Tocharian in a minute. Whereas someone like Ma Jian, like several other Muslim Chinese, was educated in Azhar University in Cairo, and he worked on Arabic Chinese contact. And I'll talk first about Ji Xianlin. When he came back from Germany, after a decade in Nazi Germany, he set up a new department of Oriental Philology at Peking University. This is Dongfang Yuanxue. And he also wrote a couple of sort of manifestos or pleas for a new Oriental philology. And it explained to the Chinese reader the scope of European Oriental philology that is larger than what is generally considered the Orient, the East, Dongfang, because African languages are included in its research. So it explains the European version of the Orient with which you're familiar. And when he set it up at Peking University, it was constrained obviously by resources, but they set up three groups. The first, Mongolian, Tibetan, Manchu. Second, Indo-European languages like Sanskrit, Pali, Tocharian I'll come to. Third group, Arabic. And they said at this time, again, this is 1940s, we hope to add new groups in the future, such as Persian and Eastern Turkic. But notice, again, these are classical languages. This is not the living languages that would later become so essential to Oriental languages and civilizations. Crucial for his account is a contact. He says that manuscript discoveries in Xinjiang and Dunhuang have transformed Oriental philology. For him, Xinjiang is a site of cultural exchanges between East and West. Eastern culture spreads westwards from here. Western culture enters eastwards from here. And that two-way model of thinking about, here he calls it jiaoliu, of exchange, is distinct from, as he talks about a lot, is distinct from the one-way model of Western civilization, the movement of the Indo-European bringing civilization into Chinese, as sort of a set of theories that had been prevalent at the late 19th and early 20th century. This changes, this model of a focus on East-West contact changes with the international anti-colonial movement that really had a kickstart with the Bandung Conference, first Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955 that China participated in. And one of the many aspects of this collaboration that brought together decolonized or various Asian, African, and Middle Eastern groups together for the first time in 1955. One aspect of the manifesto that was produced was a historical memory that goes something like this: Asia and Africa being the cradle of great religions and civilizations, which have enriched other cultures and civilizations while themselves being enriched in the process. And then it goes on to say, we want to renew these old cultural contacts. So there is a model here of ancient contact and an exchange between Asia and Africa and amongst these various countries that starts hitting the headlines in the 50s and 60s. Tanzania, Somalia, Tunisia, India, Pakistan, China, and other places. And this is an important backdrop to a slight adjustment of the paradigm towards thinking about Asia-Africa contact and ties. One example of this concerns Jixianlin's relationship to this language called Tocharian that was unknown until the late 19th century, early 20th century, when manuscripts in this hitherto unknown language were discovered in Northwest China. And the decipherer of this Indo-European language, Emil Sieg, was Jixianlin's advisor in Germany. And that's where he learned this strange language that caused a bit of a stir in the early 20th century in Europe because of its genetic affiliations. What Sieg and others discovered was that Tocharian was the easternmost Indo-European language. It still is the easternmost known Indo-European language. But what was strange is that within the Indo-European language family, there's a split between the sort of European, so-called Kentum languages, Greek, Latin, and then the sort of more Asian end of the Indo-European language, or languages like Sanskrit and Persian. And what they discovered was that Tocharian was actually more like Greek and Latin than Sanskrit and Persian. And so what happened in the discourse around Tocharian, the first question, or the most important question about Tocharian, was what were the race of Tocharian speakers? If Tocharian was an Indo-European language, then, hey presto, Tocharians themselves must have been Indo-European, and people like Albert von der Kock found and saw in the sort of Buddhist cave murals the distinction between the blue-eyed, red-headed Tocharian on the left and the so-called Asiatic on East Asian on the right. And this fascination with the genetic origins of Tocharian, and as part of various narratives of Indo-European racial migration, was something that Jixianlin, after Bandung in the 1950s and 60s, sought to challenge or to draw attention away from. And so what he started looking at is not the relationship between cognates and roots between Greek and Tocharian, but the relationship, the historical, lived social historical relation between Tocharian and Chinese, and loanwords that he found in Tocharian and in Chinese, a two-way loanwords, as well as Sanskrit Chinese loans. And he argued that Tocharian was a bridge in India-China relations, again, part of this post-Bandung rhetoric. And it was, again, a shift from thinking about genetic ancestry to the historical horizontal history of loans. And again, this two-way interest was something we also see with Ma Jian, who I'll end with here. This is my last example. Ma Jian, as I mentioned before, had studied Arabic in Cairo, and he's well known for being the editor of the first Chinese Arabic dictionary. He's translator of the Quran. And his work also paid attention to the history of contact between the Arab and Islamic world and other parts of the world, both Europe and in China. And his particular focus was on the relations between the Arab and Islamic world and China historically. And so he did a whole series of, he was mainly a linguist, but he also did a series of philological works on these loan words, on henna, fenugreek, rosewater, and how these terms were borrowed into Chinese, or words like satin, which came via zaytun, or from the Chinese Zitong, the city there. So this history of contact and exchange through language. In this example here, he says Arabs introduced many of the Chinese medicinal materials long grown in Chinese soil. Many of the Chinese names of spices and precious stones are transcriptions or translations of Arabic words. For example, Ru Xiang, literally fragrance of the breast, translates the Arabic meaning of the word. And then other words like moya is a transcription of the sound of Arabic myrrh. So there are Arabic to Chinese and also Chinese words in Arabic that, as he says, have taken, given birth to roots or taken root there. From linguistic studies, we can also see friendly relations between China and Arab countries. Now, before ending, I want to emphasize this situatedness and cultural linguistic limits of my own take on contact philology. If we move to other hubs that I haven't looked at and unable to look at, contact philology will look different. It'll yield other histories. And just for example, if we take another Chinese Muslim scholar in Urdu known as Badruddin Chini, Hai Weiliang in Chinese. He traveled to India and Egypt in the 1920s to 40s and published a history of Arab-Chinese relations that included a small discussion of Arabic and Persian words in Chinese. But because he published the work abroad in Arabic and in Urdu, and he didn't publish it, as far as I can tell, in Chinese, and because he moved to Taiwan and not to the People's Republic in the 1950s, his work was taken up in Pakistan, but not in China or the West. And I should also note the limits of philology. Given the limited archive of Chinese contact with, say, pre-modern African languages, one has to look to historians rather than to philologists for the study of China-Africa contact. So to conclude, today's talk looked at 3 small-scale and short-lived projects of what I've called contact philology. They all began during the first half of the 20th century and were over by around the 1960s. In French Indochina, in India, and in China, there were 3 distinct but dialogic efforts to make language contact into a new and sustained object of historical inquiry. And collectively, they produced an infrastructure for the study of language contact, things we're familiar with now: research centers, journals, annotated editions, glossaries and tables at the end of the editions, or etymological narratives of these loanwords that appear in popular newspapers. I've argued that contact philology was part of a multidisciplinary as well as a multi-regional transformation of contact into a research object. Contact philology borrowed its transnational frameworks from geography and history, but each discipline focused on different units of analysis. So geographers competed to produce better maps of contact. Historians debated narrative plots and heroes who were the villains of connected history. Linguists explored the sound of contact. They heard contact in borrowed syllables and rhythms, tone and meter. Philologists looked at translated text, but above all, what I've looked at today is loanwords as building blocks or relics of connected histories, symbolic relics. In some ways, philologists and linguists had a harder time legitimizing the study of contact than in these other disciplines. In the 19th century, philology was the discipline that modeled disciplinarity itself. The model of the research seminar and journals and so forth came from philology. It also provided the classificatory model for national studies across disciplines, hence the sort of structural disinterest in contact. The generation of philologists that I've looked at began their careers during the early 20th century when traditional philology was both in decline and becoming more internationalized. On the one hand, philology was being replaced by linguistics and modern literature departments. On the other, different global traditions of what we now appreciate as world philology came into closer conversation. So they were beginning this conversation earlier on. Contact philology was part of this worlding of philology in both colonial and in anti-colonial contexts. In the three instances that I've addressed, contact philology emerged as a reparative effort to come to terms with the limits of a comparative philology that was centered on Indo-European languages. So we've seen French Orientalists in the Far East argued the need to look beyond the family tree, the need to bring together Sanskritists and sinologists. And in India and China, anti-colonial philologists sought to recover and revive Sino-Indian or Afro-Asian connections that preceded modern European colonialism. As in disciplines like history, the study of two-way contact self-consciously displaced the trope of Westernization and Indo-European racial conquest. So in sum, contact philology was an effort to repair philology from within, to come to terms with rather than forget ideologies, inconvenient ideologies. This differs from the post-1970 study of language contact in post-colonial studies and comparative literature. Now, our contemporary critical idiom of contact studies, for example, the modern contact zone, the translation zone, translingual practices and planetarity and so on, they no longer privilege classical languages. But contact philology nonetheless points to an earlier generation of contact studies who by turning from word roots to word routes, from cognates to loanwords, de-emphasize questions of grammar, descent, and pure origins, and elevated the social history of language contact. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really rich and full, and I'm trying to formulate this question properly, stepping back maybe from some of the specifics and thinking about the way that you were setting up a distinction between what you're calling contact philology and what it does, and the kind of narrative that it generated, and kind of, let's say, standard philology, right? The tree model, the focus on grammar, things like that. And I guess I wanted to go back to this question of the kind of story the two different approaches could tell, and specifically around the question of the origin story. And it seems like you're saying that the standard philology was really kind of focused on racial migration and as a kind of explanatory for who the people that spoke these languages were, and that contact philology is a kind of allows for a different thing. It's more kind of about relationships. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, and you mentioned in the beginning when you were introducing it, that it had a more affective aspect. And the example you gave talked about kind of friendship, like the presence of loan words as denoting a certain kind of friendship. But were there, could you speak a little bit more about that affective and relation-based alternative to the standard narrative, and whether there were any ways of understanding the presence of words, loan words as, you know, more sordid kinds of relationships?
Just want to go back to this. Thank you. That sort of gets to the heart of things. Yes, thank you. So yes, I am trying to draw out a distinction, as you said, between, I guess what Said would say, affiliative versus filiative forms of relations, affective versus genetic. And I'm sort of very schematically saying the traditional followed the sort of vertical lines of descent, and the study of contact followed the sort of social, historical, horizontal forms of relationship between languages. And the emphasis in the traditional mode was a focus on sort of the proto-languages, a sort of a time scale of history that goes to hypothetical prehistorical time as the site of pursuit, as what the question that was the elevated time, the proto-historical as the time of, you know, racial origins, linguistic origins, versus a time scale of contact philology that's really in media res. It's going straight for what's written in the classical texts and not pushing back. It's a sort of the antiquity. It's looking at historical contact after origins. And I think you're absolutely right. And I try to stress that I don't see contact philology as liberatory. I think the sort of suspicious, one needs to be, I think Emily Apter puts it, suspicious about loan words as being some kind of part of a sort of thinking about a cultural heritage as being elevated as hybrid in some way. And I think when you say loan words as being sordid, the space of contact philology that I've been emphasizing is on the sort of what you might see as being progressive, as seeing language as always already mixed and as always already inseparable. That's Schuchart's model. But of course, the space of contact philology also accommodates traditional philology, and the entire narrative of racial migration and conquest is a form of thinking about conquest philology, but it's doing it for a different purposes, precisely to sort of go back in time rather than to look at the time itself. It's social history versus sort of looking internal versus external as of history in that sense. So your question as to the effective end of things, I think this is where it's useful to look at other disciplines and to look at more explicit, especially amongst historians, a much more explicit critical approach to what we mean by contact itself. So there is amongst the historians, and who I didn't talk about at all, in these different places and times, a much more explicit critique of models of contact that are really about the most standard narrative is of westernization and the movement east of Western civilization, and that being a model, it could be seen as being effective and friendly, you know, as part of social history. But what, again, my project is descriptive, not prescriptive. What I'm interested in is a set of people, historians, philologists, and otherwise, who are saying, well, let's look again at that and again, loan words, where you don't get the kind of the plot. It's not a history of, you're just looking at an archive. And even if, you know, as we know from looking at, you know, modern Creoles, there can be a history of, you know, imposition of a language on another. What they're interested in is reconstructing, especially in the context of Asia and Africa language exchange, a history of what comes to be called explicitly a friendship. So the Afro-Asian language of solidarity, friendship, is a model, a social model that is imposed. And so nowadays, contact linguists, they have substrate, superstrate, adstrate, different ways of talking about the social conditions in which one language seems to affect vocab rather than grammar more. And it's not always, it doesn't always match the power relation. So it can be that the conquered place actually, you know, Greek and Latin, I mean, they're different examples, but, you know, context in which the conquering language actually absorbs more from those they conquer. So there is now a much more sophisticated language for that in linguistics. And I'm just interested in descriptively looking at how this generation of Oriental philologists were themselves trying to reconfigure and use some of the same materials really to tell a different story, when actually you're still just looking at loanwords. But some are telling it, it's just the narratives, the stories they tell with loanwords in their lexicon that I'm trying to map out, that they're seeing this as a site for debating colonial versus anti-colonial forms of knowledge production. It is that, but it's a slight adjustment of focus. There is, you know, people weren't, they were the people who were interested in loanwords, Tokarian loanwords, are often those who are, you know, against the Indo-Aryan paradigms. They're interested in ties between, you know, Semitic and Aryan languages. I mean, there is a, or Boaz with Native American languages, you know, there is a critique of the underpinning, you know, racial ideology of philology that's there in the background as well. So there's nothing intrinsic to it being, you know, sorted, or I'm interested in the history of uses, the history of interpretations. Does that? Okay. Yes, and then.
Because talking about loan words, and that kind of stuff, what kind of social, political, and cultural factors precipitate a large scale of borrowing across language and contact zones, and what do power dynamics between speech communities shape borrowing patterns and the integrations of loan words? Because if I think of loan words, it happens a lot in the language that I know, for example, Chinese and Japanese. It feels like there's a lot of Western words, that's loan words, but I just barely see any in Western languages. You see Eastern loan words, and that there's most of the time, like, is there a pattern to what kind of loan words, the integration of those kind of loan words?
You're just in general.
Yeah.
So I'll just say two things. I mean, I'm looking at let me just say two things. One, your question is really one that one should give to a contact linguist now. Those are exactly those kinds of questions that they ask. You know, what are the conditions? What are the patterns and the conditions of language borrowing? But also things like the main vehicle for language borrowing is the noun, not the verb. It's the lexicon, not the grammar, although there is contact-induced grammar change. So that's one dimension. It's, you know, you're looking at commodities and loanwords and that sort of history, which is why, you know, Hobson and Jobson, it's a big, you know, book that big of Anglo-Indian words. A lot of it is just things, and even now. So the conditions, it's a harder one. And I can give you biblio to look at. Tomasin and Korfman, they set out a whole set of, and contact linguists now, they have a whole set of conditions for these interactions. And it happens all the time. You know, Chinese, Lydia Liu's work on Chinese and his borrowings from other languages. there's a large field out there of studying this. Does that answer your question? I won't go into all the examples, but there's a lot of work on that.
No, it's for the people. Oh, okay. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about, so it seems like sometimes when you're talking about contact philology, there seems to be sort of like an economic idiom underneath it, right? People talk about exchange or intercourse, and at least from the examples you gave of like Mazian, right? Like a lot of the loan words are actually names of not just things, but commodities, right? And so in the rhetoric of this sort of like Afro-Asian friendship, I'm wondering if there's also this engagement with the sort of like political economy of contact philology, if you put it that way. Yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you. I'll just say two small things. Yes, so the metaphors of language contact are, as you point out, taken from the world of commerce, the loan, the calc. They have to do with sort of surface relations, unlike cognate root and so forth. So you're absolutely right that there is more to the history of commercial intercourse is one of the places where interest in language contact appears as a kind of adjunct. And that was exactly the point I'm trying to make, is that the specialized study of loanwords comes from geographers who are interested in the history of commerce, not from philologists and linguists at that time, although they take it and they take the language directly. I mean, even contact zone, Mary Louise Pratt, she's taking that, she explicitly says, I'm taking this from contact linguistics and the study of commercial languages. So there's that. I think you're getting to sort of a deeper question about the ways in which people talk and reflect upon loanwords in its relationship to the political economy. And there is one Indian philologist, Kosambi, who does give a sort of Marxist account of how loanwords develop and the sort of the modes of production that are necessary in order to produce loanwords. But it's not the kind of model for loanwords or even contact that's adopted in, say, China. So there isn't a lot in Marxist and Maoist historiography about contact that makes it theoretically meaningful, because much of the work that's done on Afro-Asian contact comes out of an anti-colonial Marxist alliance, with its terms coming from a sort of non-aligned movement and interest in friendly relations and so forth, as opposed to coming from a materialist critique of language or something like that. So that's a disjunct that I found anyway in what I've been looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. From other reading, I was somewhat familiar with the Dunhuang manuscripts, and that among those manuscripts, there were discovered some Nestorian or Syriac Christian manuscripts that, in Chinese, that documented an early Christian mission to China, and that for many scholars in Europe and in Asia, this was very exciting, this notion of an early contact between Christianity and Buddhism, whether that developed into anything or not. And so, I mean, we've talked a bit about, economics and politics in contributing to this, but when I think of contact, I also think of contact across religious spheres, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of that together. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of religion in this sort of study, either as a driving force, or how this sort of study contributed to the development of a notion of comparative religions as well.
That's a great question. I'm not going to give it the space it deserves. So yes, religion is, and religious studies, comparative religion is a very important vehicle for the study of contact and it's one of the sort of, it's not a discipline that I have looked at enough, but it is fundamental to the ways in which people are looking at it. So already with, Ma Jian, Badruddin Al-Chini, there is, and also in East Africa and Tanzania, there are ways in which the study of, for example, in that case, Islamic commercial cosmopolitanism from, around the second millennium, early second millennium onwards, is a driving force for certain hubs that I'm not able to follow fully, for bringing together and systematizing the study of language contact. And again, I'm also still looking a lot at Chinese. In the case of Syriac, the historian Christianity, that's not as important, or hasn't been as big in this picture as, say, the study of Buddhist history. So the Pan-Asian discourse around in Japan, in India, and in China to a degree as well, the discourse around Pan-Asian future and past of Pan-Asian contact, that is premised on a sort of idealized Buddhist past. And that gets emphasized over and above something like Nestorian Christianity, of which the archive is small, and it doesn't come together during the period I'm looking at as much. So I think, Buddhism and Islam are two central sites. I don't have more to say about it than them, but it's a great question, something I am looking more into. So thank you.
Thanks a lot for your talk. And I just have a question about philology in general, because you mentioned the decline of philology and also the rise of modern social sciences and the modern institutions. I'm wondering if the decline of philology has to do with its focus exclusively on words, because in both classical and contact philology, as you mentioned, we're focusing on either loan words or words from historical texts. That that basically defines philology as a discipline, right? It hasn't changed. If we're looking at some sort of other data, we shift to another discipline. In some sense, I tend to think philologists as the archaeologists of words. You're focusing on mostly on words. Do you think they're what are the pros and cons of this approach? And would that explain the decline or our attempt to revive philology in this age?
That's a big question. I think, again, this talk and this project is descriptive, not prescriptive. And I think I'll just say two things. This is not sort of my scholarship. It's just, I'll repeat what I've read about philology. But I think the important aspect of the decline of philology was its strange sort of hybrid mix that became incoherent of being a discipline that, Sheldon Pollock will say, for the future, is that, the discipline of making sense of text, right? So the main unit of analysis there is text, not words per se, but I have given greater emphasis to words. But what happens is that linguistics as a science of language, and then modern languages, modern literatures, start to replace philology for various reasons, and philology no longer becomes as coherent as something singular. And that's the aspect that makes me sort of split things up into philology and linguistics. So that doesn't fully answer your question, but I think it's, it's there in the background. And I've looked more at words than texts, but yeah.
Yeah, that's probably my wrong understanding, because I thought it's just about words, but it's also about the text, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks again for wonderful presentation, and also really great questions and answers. But just really quick, I was curious about this one slide you had that had the Sanskrit and the Chinese transliteration, I believe. And then on the side, there's also, I think,
This one?
Japanese katakana.
Oh,
is it?
this
Yeah,
one.
that one.
Yeah,
I'm just
yes, right.
curious why the Japanese is there if you're if
That's
you knew
a
and-
good question.
yeah.
This is the copy itself is Japanese, and as Professor Lurie will explain that and this is why I think, Japan was one of the many hubs that I think complicate my picture profoundly. But there is a systematic interest in language contact and in, developing a kind of syllabary in order to better represent the sounds of Sanskrit in ways that Chinese characters could not. And so part of the what comes out of this sort of Siddham studies is by scholars like Kukai is this effort to use Japanese syllabaries to clarify even more accurately what the Chinese characters cannot. And so there's a large archive that includes the Japanese transcriptions that are actually more helpful than the Chinese characters. So it's a trilingual endeavor that complicates the picture.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think this is a very helpful presentation. I think I can tell like the difference between philology and contact philology. It seems like philology, quote unquote, traditional philologies like benefited a lot from studies of place names, for example, not really loan words, right? But I think your idea of contact philology, like with the focus on loan words, definitely shed light on philology. But I'm wondering why you are making the argument that contact philology is a modern phenomenon. And it seems like even in early modern, for example, Leibniz asked for letters from Jesuits and for the materials about Chinese languages. And also, for example, in the 6th century Chinese bibliography, there is a specific genre which has dozens of works about languages of the Indo-Asian people. So I'm wondering, actually, contact philology is a long time historical phenomenon. And the last question, which is related to this, is that do we really have a philology that is not a contact philology?
So absolutely, yes. I don't think I did say that contact philology is a purely modern phenomenon. What I did say is that I'm looking at 1870 to 1970, what's going on then in a set of places. This is, how you write a book, or how not to write a book. So absolutely. So as, in fact, what in another chapter I look at is precisely how projects like this are a form of contact philology, a form of contact linguistics that form a distinct, so the Buddhist Siddham studies, the Buddhist comparative study of Sanskrit in first millennium was precisely a methodical, rigorous study of language contact. One of many examples around the world, and I think people who know better in this room, there are other examples of that. What I'm looking at is what's happening during this period that with relationship to the study of China's connected past. And I'm just trying to track a set of sort of pulses, or a set of beacons of study that emerge after the Opium Wars. I'm just trying to track that out, but you're absolutely right. So is what, the sort of the Schuchart question, is all philology actually contact philology? Well, I think what I'm trying to point to is a very self-critical, a very explicit argument that Saussure, William Jones, Greason are making, that contact philology is minor, it's secondary, it's external, it is structurally, theoretically less important than the focus on a set of project proto-languages, genetic classification and so forth. So I think there is something that contact linguists have already identified as being a problem that had to be overcome in order for a subfield that we have, 1980s onwards of contact linguistics to emerge. But thank you for your question.
Oh, yeah, hi. I wanted to link two things from your talk. the relationship, the East and West exchange or cultural exchange through language. And then the interest, the French and German strong interest in linguistics. And underlying that, I wanted to bring up 19th century philosophy, and in particular, the importance that was accorded to language. Language, in fact, as a determinant of thought and a primary vehicle of culture. In particular, you had strong tradition in Germany, starting with anthropology and von Humboldt and so on. And then you had the German philosopher, dramatist Friedrich Schiller, who wrote about the superiority of the German language, precisely because it has the closest roots to Indian origins. And then you have Nietzsche, and of course, extolling India, thus spake Zarathustra, and so on. So I just wanted your comment on, the importance of this underlying current, and then in fact, Europeans were in a sense searching for authenticity in Western culture by attempting to find roots in the East, although maybe they didn't go far east enough, but at least in India. So just for your comment.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yes, so the distinction that I'm trying to make is precisely between European Indophilia and the relationship to Sanskrit on the one hand, that precisely as you said, is looking back to an origin story, but also both an effective and a genetic ancestry there. So the romanticism that comes out of that versus an interest in, say, Sanskrit that's in the Afro-Asian movement and Sino-Indian studies that is about seeing your history as my history. Our histories are back there together. They're all intertwined. It is a history of contact. And that is also looking back at a history of, say, Siddham studies in which there was already contact there. So there's not a sense of a vertical past. It's about thinking about that relationship to a different kind of Indophilia that's about contact. Yes. Yes, the fantasy is of that, and that's the distinction very schematically there. Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay.
I'm gonna hand it to you. Wow, no pressure. I had a question. Thanks for the talk. I'm pretty new to philology, so I had a bit of a methodological question. And I was wondering, how do you do contact philology when the object of study or like the locale is unstable? I'm thinking particularly in that a lot of these places don't really have stable borders throughout time. China, certainly, the borders of the empire change. India in particular, if we're thinking about anti-colonialism, after empire, those borders shift. And also these places are home to a lot of different languages as well. So I was wondering, how do you do contact philology when citizenship and belonging and who even constitutes as China, India, or all these places in the global South, what languages even constitute as Chinese, East African, South Asian languages are. And also, I don't know, are there further implications of scholars in those places doing contact philology, needing to like fix a certain national vision and closed border understanding of their home country? Like, how do you navigate these layers of power relations in this kind of like quite horizontal and network study? I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. I think it's again, how do we do contact philology? And I think I am interested in that. I think again, I've been doing a description of what I think these people are thinking, what they're doing, how they're doing it. And so, but to answer your question, all of the sort of the lexicons of loanwords and the studies of loanwords are often precisely, as you're saying, about deracinated languages, pidgin languages that are they're coming out of ports and ships and caravan trade and so forth, temporary, languages of exigency and so forth. So the collection of words into a book, the dictionaries of Lascari, for example, of this sort of mix of Hindustani, Cantonese, and all these port captains had. Those are the practices of language collection, of thinking about loan words that have happened. So if you're asking how do we do that now, if that's your question, because all of this, so what I tried to show is that these are texts that have come from scattered across Central Asia. They're texts that have been taken from people who've been traveling in colonial ports most of their lives. So they are doing the gathering. And that's the archive. If you're saying, how do we go about looking at, the question is, how do we go about looking at it now? Is that your question?
Perhaps for example, like what does a Sino-Indian contact philology look like when it's hard to even temporalize China and India as two static points, if that makes any sense?
You mean why call it Sino-Indian?
Oh no, like how does that look like? What does that look like? Or do you just kind of clarify like, oh, I'm looking at this time period and then that's
well, I
just
think
it?
Again, it's back to that, that critique of Oriental philology that came from the colonial French Indo-China, which is let's look at a geography, a region, and not a country or a people, right? And then let's look at everything that happens in this period of time, or this ocean, in this continent, and then use that as a perspective, geographical perspective, rather than linguistic, racial, and national one. I think that's the shift.
So the Chinese doesn't have to correspond to the nation we call China.
Exactly.
And Indian doesn't have to correspond to the place that we now call India. I mean, I think that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like it's also dependent on the location of the archives and the extent of them.
Yes. It is. Absolutely. I think it's quite late right now. You're kind of fading some of it. Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Chen. This was really a magnificent way for us to restart the program. And I'm also grateful to everyone in the audience for such fantastic questions as well. So
Thank you. That's fantastic.
thanks so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.